Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this new meeting on the series of the Finance Network titled In Conversation, Exploring the Philosophy of Money and Finance. This series features various interviews, and today we are excited to host Boudewijn Bruin from the University of Groningen, who will be interviewed by Lisa Wareski from the CUNY Grad Center. Thank you very much, Bodin and Lisa, for accepting our invitation. Today's interview is titled Climate Change and Reflexive Law, the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and is inspired by a chapter authored by Boudewijn in the recently published book, The Philosophy of Money and Finance, edited by yeah, that's him. Jürgen Sandberg and Lisa Wareski for Oxford University Press. And after the interview, we will have debate. You can ask your question raising your virtual hand by clicking the button, the Zoom menu, and then we manage the queue. So that's all from me for now. Let's begin the interview and enjoy it.
Okay, thank you, Emiliano. So I'm pleased. Have you got me on screen?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. I'm very pleased to introduce Boudewijn de Bruin. He's professor at the University of Groningen and the University of Gothenburg. His current work is on business ethics and sustainability, and in particular, climate change, biodiversity, and finance. Boudewijn holds master's degrees in mathematics and philosophy from the University of Amsterdam and also a PhD degree from the University of Amsterdam. He has held visiting positions at Harvard Business School and Cambridge University, among others. He's the author of numerous books and papers on ethics and finance, and he has consulted to or taught incidental programs for various multinational financial institutions. He's also a board member of the Ethics, Culture, and Behavior faculty of the Royal Netherlands Institute of Chartered Accountants. With Alex Oliver from Cambridge University, he directed a large research project on trust and finance, which involved stakeholders from the banking sector and that was financed by the Dutch Research Council. I should mention that this grant funded several PhD students, including Marco Meyer and Jens van Klooster, who are now researchers in the developing field of the philosophy of finance. It also spawned a book that examined some of the ethical and epistemic blind spots that lay at the heart of the global financial crisis. This book has a memorable title. It's Ethics in the Global Financial Crisis, Why Incompetence is Worse Than Greed. So without too much further ado, let me start the interview here. And again, this is on Boudewijn's chapter in The Philosophy of Finance, an edited volume. Chapter title is Climate Change and Reflexive Law, the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan. Okay, so this is a complex subject, and I thought perhaps we should begin by you just telling us what the European Sustainable Finance Action Plan is, how did it come about, and broadly speaking, what are its aims?
So I wanted to introduce this action plan, the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. It arose it was published in 2018 by the European Commission, inspired by a lot of work by experts, scholars, practitioners in the sustainable finance world, and in particular a report written by a high-level expert group on sustainable finance, which was published a few years earlier. And as I said, there are three aims to this action plan. And they are a little bit of a mixed bag. It's interesting to see how they were combined. But the starting point is the observation that if we want to reach the Paris Agreement goals, that then what we need is estimated to be about 180 billion euros annually in the EU alone. And that estimate has increased over the years. So the estimates have really changed. It's maybe around 250 billion already. And the plan develops certain concrete strategies to make sustainable finance investments more, they bring them on the radar of retail investors. So that's one thing, reorientation of capital flows towards sustainable finance. The second observation is that in the typical risk management strategies that the financial services industry deploys, climate change is underrepresented, is not taken care of in a sufficiently rigorous way, sometimes not even at all. And the plan proposes that these models, these risk management models, are changed in such a way that climate risks are taken into account. And it's not only climate risk. I should note that sustainability in the Sustainable Finance Action Plan is a broader range of topics. It's climate change, it's environment, but it also includes social issues, where we can think of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, for instance. And a lot of these risks are not included in current risk management strategies, and that's what the second aim of the plan is, to change that. And the third aim is concerned with long-termism. For philosophers in the audience, long-termism easily spans 1,000 years, maybe 10,000 years. In finance, the long term is maybe 10 years. So there is really a lot of progress to be made by looking at more longer term issues in finance. And the idea behind the plan is that in order to actually judge sustainable finance plans, what we need is this more long-term mindset of managers, but also of investors judging the value of projects.
Okay, good. We'll get into this in some more detail, but could you say a little bit at this juncture about some of the specific actions that the action plan recommends? How are these goals to be achieved?
There's a lot of actions. Some of them have actually really been realized, or at least the European Union has started realizing them. So let me mention the most important ones in this regard. So I think the most important one related to the action plan or associated with it is the EU taxonomy. So the taxonomy is an initiative that aims to lead to a uniform description of economic activities and evaluating their sustainability. So there is an enormously complex but also really useful taxonomy and a set of recommendations of how to describe the impacts of economic activities on a variety of stakeholders, climate, environment, but also, as I said, social issues. And that's one of the key deliverables that the action plan has led to. The second example is a system of standards, a label system that help retail investors to make a choice between various types of bonds in this case. And what has come out of that a few years ago is the European Union Green Bond Regulation, which describes certain or develops certain criteria for bonds. And if they satisfy these criteria, then they can be classified as green. And the idea here is to make these bonds align with the criteria specified in the taxonomy. So these are really the most important initiatives so far. There's also disclosure, sustainable finance disclosure regulation is an important instrument in this respect. There's recommendations about methods of financial forecasting. So the recommendation to do scenario testing instead of using historical analysis. And there are some other initiatives surrounding financial advice and the role of duties of fund managers.
Okay, good. Thank you. This is very helpful. In your chapter, you say that the legislative instruments of the action plan are reflexive and thus reflect a reflexive law approach. So could you tell us something about what reflexive law is and which of these directives in the plan are reflexive?
Yeah, so reflexive law is a term developed in legal scholarship and sociology by a German legal scholar and sociologist, Gunther Teubner. And it's been used and popularized in US legal scholarship by Eric Orts, particularly in environmental law. And the idea is that we look at the type of legal instruments or techniques that make people reflect on their actions. And the typical examples that you have to think of in this regard involve disclosure, reporting, labeling, auditing, review. So that's the type of instrument that we have to think of. And I could say something about the background of these developments, because it's really a change in the way that we've been thinking about law. If you look at the history of environmental law from the 1960s, then what you see is that in the early days, the idea was that environmental problems had to be solved using private law. So this was basically a market-based type of solutions with Pigouvian taxation, for instance, or tradable pollution rights. Things were organized on the market, and negative externalities would have to be priced in, ideally, in these transactions. But somewhere in the 1970s, with a bigger awareness of environmental problems, for instance, think of the Club of Rome report, there was an awareness that these private law initiatives actually didn't really work, or at least they didn't work as well as people had expected. So legislators increasingly turn to administrative law solutions. So in the US, there is the Clean Air Act, if I'm correct. In Europe, we've got the Habitats and the Birds directives, and they endow the executive with a number of powers that traditionally, or in the private law solution, would be more in the province of the judiciary. And then in the 1980s, the next step was taken, because this administrative law approach to environmental issues turned out to be cognitively extremely demanding. If you look at the sheer size of the legislation and also the case law, the jurisprudence on this, no one could call themselves an expert. And Gunther Teubner, for instance, in his publications, refers to Habermas's idea of juridification, and also points out that in that type of situation, there is a potential lack of democratic legitimacy, because we actually don't know anymore what is going on and what links the decisions of the legislative to the actual enforcement decisions that the executive makes. And that is the phase of environmental law where reflexive law comes into play. So what people develop in the 1980s, 1990s is a type of law that is, in a sense, more simple, but it outsources the thinking and the reflection to the businesses, to private people, and is, in that sense, an alternative both to the market-based approach and to the administrative or command and control approach, as Orts calls it. Procedures and processes have to be followed. People have to report, and the idea is that by going through these procedures and processes and by doing the reporting, you encourage a sort of self-reflection, and the self-reflection is expected to lead to behavior that conforms to the norms.
Okay, good. This brings me into my next question. You say in your chapter that the approach in the action plan is not only reflexive, but also epistemic. Could you say a word about this?
Yeah, so the idea is that a reflexive approach is that it works because it leads to internal and external pressure on, for instance, business people. People will be scrutinized, businesses will be scrutinized by external stakeholders, maybe civil society organizations or shareholders, employees, consumers. And the idea is that will lead to a change. My analysis actually shows that in order to get that off the ground, what we need is a better view of of the way in which information is actually processed by all these various parties that are involved. So self-reflection is an important aim to realize. So reflective law really tries to inspire that. But what I would like to add is a richer notion of information, where we make more precise how that self-reflection takes place. And in the paper, I show that we can distinguish here between sort of a procedural epistemic type of instruments that influence the way that people gain knowledge, process, and store them. And then we can think about examples like regulations about transparency and reporting, right? That is a procedural requirement about how companies have to deal with certain bits of information and transmit them or communicate them to stakeholders. On the other hand, there's also a bunch of substantive epistemic requirements that reflexive law may introduce. And they have to do with things like justification, the standards of evidence. So if the EU action plan proposes that instead of historical analysis, we are going to adopt scenario analysis to estimate climate change risks, then that is a substantive epistemic instrument, because it tells modelers, forecasters, that they have to accept certain or have to use certain bits of evidence rather than others. So that is the place where reflexive law turns epistemic, and where these epistemic insights from social epistemology particularly become relevant, I believe.
Okay, good. In your chapter, you offer some, criticisms of the plan, as written now, and also some proposals for overcoming the limitations. And I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on a couple of those.
Yeah, I think that in a sense, the reflexive law approach is risks being too optimistic about the effects of reflexive law on self-reflection, right? The claim is that self-reflection will be the result of these reflexive law initiatives, and that self-reflection is going to lead to behavioral change. But that isn't necessarily the case. And interestingly, if you go through these EU documents, you see this acknowledged at various junctures. The taxonomy regulation acknowledges that even if we have a nice taxonomy telling us what type of economic activities are sustainable, then still investors will be free not to invest in these activities. But I think that is too simple an answer. I think it is. We can say more, both by restricting the optimism perhaps about reflexive law, but also by suggesting different avenues for valuable reflexive or epistemic initiatives. And what I highlight in the chapter is that we can do that by combining some insight from philosophy with insights from psychology and economics. For instance, behavioral finance, but also the standard belief desire framework that we have in philosophy and in psychology. And the way I illustrate this is by looking at a very simple example of a person receiving information while they're on their way to the railway station, and then changing their behavior, right? So you see this person walking back, and that may be due to the fact that the person has received some information, maybe over a mobile phone call, about, for instance, construction works on the railway system that have caused a lot of delays. So he's going back to the city and is going to take the bus, or maybe a friend has called him up and said, "Look, I'm in town. Why not join me for dinner?" And then the person has changed their preferences. So receiving a bit of information and a phone call may lead to a change in beliefs or a change in preferences, or maybe to both. And that simple model is something that I use in the chapter to distinguish between the potential effects that providing investors with information about sustainable finance will have on their investment activities. And I show that belief revision is not likely to happen because the person who is interested in these green bond labeling schemes, for instance, already comes with a lot of beliefs about green opportunities. If you're a green-minded investor, you already know to a very large extent that there are rankings available that you can use, and you don't need another ranking. And on the other hand, if the idea is that what happens in the retail investor's preference change, then that is equally unlikely to happen as a result of presenting information from the EU taxonomy or labeling schemes, because the mere ranking or labeling of financial products isn't going to make you turn into or turn you into a green-minded investor. At least that's what I show. So I think there are problems here, but as I said, there's also a way out.
Okay, I think your slogan is something along the lines: different information presented differently, for the chapter. And so what were some of the ways out? You do offer a couple
I think
of ideas
that
in the chapter.
Yeah, so there's two slogans that I want to highlight here. But before starting with the slogans, it's important to point out that these the way that practitioners should actually use these results is always very context dependent. So I borrow the term from Popper, piecemeal engineering. This is something that requires a lot of empirical day-to-day testing on the ground to find out what works. But I think that some of the research that I consulted while writing the chapter led me to develop two different ways in which people might be provided with information. So the first is indeed to provide different types of information. So there's an interesting study that shows that experiencing disasters, or also getting information about disasters that are linked to climate change, makes climate change more salient and also increases demand for sustainable finance. It's a paper that I refer to in the chapter. So this may suggest something at this moment, still a very general suggestion, but potentially useful, that retail investors should also be confronted with non-financial information concerning or relevant to issues such as green bonds. So the idea behind the action plan is that the information we want to give to European citizens is primarily concerned with the financial instruments. But perhaps that is not the way to go. Perhaps the way to increase demand for sustainable finance, which is one of the aims of the plan, is rather to provide people with different types of information. And the second slogan is indeed to provide information in a different way. So even if you want to stick to providing investors with financial information, that maybe the way you do this will have to be adjusted to the particular audience. So there's a very interesting paper that was that's still in its early stages, but worth mentioning, showing that if you make people read sustainability reports, then this doesn't actually increase demand for green bonds. So providing people with more information about what exactly they invest their money in may not be the way to bridge that gap of 180 billion euros annually. What does help is a famous paper by Hartzmark and Sussman in 2019. They investigated the effect of a very simple visual rating system that Morningstar used to communicate sustainability rankings. And they showed actually that ranking system, simple as it is, does have an effect and changes or increases demand for sustainable investment. So I think that the lesson from these two types of research is that we want to think about the way in which people process information in a more empirically rigorous way, inspired by some observations from the theory of action and epistemology.
Okay, excellent. I want to leave time for questions, so maybe I'll finish up by asking you what the impact of the action plan has been thus far, and what further developments have you observed since the time you wrote your paper? Because I think you would have completed this chapter about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think I've included materials up to the end of 2022.
Yeah.
And I already ignored a few things that were going on then that weren't really relevant to the chapter. but is probably worth mentioning here, and that's the renewed sustainable finance strategy, which is in a sense, a sort of a follow-up to the action plan that wants to also include small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, in the picture, as well as a more international view of sustainable finance. But the most important, as I said, deliverables or results so far include the EU taxonomy of sustainable activities, which I think I mischaracterized before because I think I suggested that this also includes social issues, but that's not the case. There's disclosure frameworks. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is important in this regard. The Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, lots of other things. I mean, this is just name dropping, but it's important to see that these initiatives have immense repercussions for the financial services industry, particularly with regard to disclosure. There's a lot that is going on, and it puts a lot of pressure on companies, but also on accountants to do non-financial sustainability auditing. And the third one is these EU green bond standards. That is an initiative from 2023, so it's really new. And my sense is that that we're in a phase of consolidation. It's not we're not there yet, but things are coming together. And I must actually say that when I was preparing for this interview, I also wanted to reevaluate my somewhat pessimistic view of the prospects. And interestingly, last week in the Financial Times, I read a small newspaper article on what is called the green asset ratio, which is something that the European Banking Authority has introduced as a measure to, basically capture the extent to which a company or a bank is taxonomy aligned. And the European Investment Bank, which is one big EU financing institution, is very worried about how well they are going to score in terms of their green asset ratio. They've always seen thought of themselves as a very green, climate-oriented institution, but the report in the Financial Times suggests that they will only have a green asset ratio of 1%, which is very, very low. And the tension that this or the awareness that has led to within the European Investment Bank is, I think, exactly what a reflexive law proponent would want to see. We're reporting a certain ratio. It sounds extremely abstract, but we also realize that it's much too low, and now we have to change our behavior internally because we also expect some external pressure to start. So maybe there is also some reason for optimism about this initiative after all.
Okay, excellent. So I think on that note, let's turn it over to Emiliano and questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Boudewijn and Lisa, for this stimulating interview. So we can now begin the debate. And to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand by clicking the button on the Zoom menu. I have a question, so I can break the ice. I don't see question coming from the audiences. Yes, thank you, Boudewijn. I have a question about the future of these green investments. And so I feel that these laws are a way, in a sense, of increasing virtually demand for these kind of green assets. And so my question is about the possibility of a bubble. If you see the risk of a green bubble coming the next few years because of this artificial demand, I don't know. I don't know how to label it, but it seems that pushing so much on these kind of assets and creating so much demand will produce much more offer. but I don't know if this is the economy. And so
Yeah.
that's my question.
Well, that's an interesting question. And in a sense, you're also questioning the validity of the estimate of the investment or the financing gap. So if the investment gap, if the estimate is accurate, then the money is needed. Then there is a demand for funding. But there are people, indeed, also colleagues in Groningen, like Dirk Bezemer, who argue that we shouldn't really think about sustainable finance, or we shouldn't think about this issue as a matter of a financing problem. But so he's more optimistic that the money is there, but it's more a matter of we need to start realizing the actual projects on the ground. So to combine that view, which I hope I have represented correctly, to the question that you make, yeah, you might argue that if no one actually engages in green projects, that then yeah, in the end the money isn't necessary, and this might lead to a bubble. But for me, this is really speculating a little bit outside of my zone of expertise. But it's certainly an interesting question to ask.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answer. I don't know if there are other questions coming from the audience. Otherwise, okay, Lisa.
I ask you a question. Yeah, I want to come back to the idea of presenting non-financial information. And I don't know if this is something you've thought about or is being done, but it seems that if you were to, let potential investors know how their investment might help, so rather than just making people more aware of the need for investing, is there a way to kind of tell people, if you were to invest, say in these projects, this is how your money would help, or, you could direct your money this way and it would have a certain impact. Is that part of what you were thinking about when you were thinking about presenting different information, say of a financial sort?
I think that's a great idea. I think that I mean, I don't have an answer to, or at least I don't have a lot of concrete suggestions that would help practitioners to develop these sorts of information campaigns, if you wish. This is really the task for the industry, together with people primarily, I think, in behavioral finance, maybe marketing, to discover what works and what doesn't work. And I find it immensely interesting to read the research that has been carried out in this area, which isn't really a lot. This is really a very open area of research at the moment, where lots of behavioral finance people are increasingly turning to, of course. So, but my sense is indeed that if you make things more concrete and that you make issues more salient, that may help people to move their money to these projects. The interesting observation about the example of the European Investment Bank is that, in a sense, it wasn't exactly what I was criticizing in the chapter, because I was criticizing the approach that reflexive law is a good instrument to draw the retail investor into this area. But the European Investment Bank is not a retail investor. So in the end, it's still an open question whether this is going to actually increase demand among European citizens. That's basically what we're talking about for that type of products. But I think that making things more concrete and linking it not only to purely financial information, but also to other types of information may certainly help.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's Joachim.
Hi, thank you, Boudewijn. I had a question. If the idea is that this is just providing information, feeding back, and then ultimately being steered by the interests and values of retail investors, then there might also be a setback. There might be people from sort of counterculture, people who want to increase fossil fuels because they think, oh, this is so woke, this is so politically correct. What do you think about that? Sort of just leaving it to the market opens up also for these counter movements against sustainable development.
Yeah, I think that this is certainly a serious concern, or more generally, the concern is it's difficult to predict what the retail investor is going to do, and leaving the financing problem of these well, what is it, 180 billion euros a year to retail investors is maybe a strategy of last resort. So there's also people, at least in informal discussions, that have said this is not the way we should go, because we outsource the responsibility for solving climate change to individuals instead of to governments. And we shouldn't. We should be doing this because we are all increasingly, we feel increasingly powerless in the face of these challenges, which may actually lead to all sorts of unexpected types of attitudes. Apathy may be one of them, but other people may actually turn to extreme opposites of these positions, as you point out. And I think that is a serious worry. I don't know whether I'm qualified to say anything about what the most likely trajectory will be, but I do think that that there is a problem when we outsource big problems such as solving climate change to individual citizens in this way. Not because that is sort of ideologically a wrong-headed decision, but because it is a very risky strategy, as you point out.
Okay, so thank you for this answer, Boudewijn. I don't know if there are other questions coming from the audience. So, yes, thank you, Kathleen.
I had a question about the retail investor versus, for instance, institutional investors. I mean, I'm thinking about the notion of long-termism, which I think is hard for the individual investor to wrap their minds around, because typically their own, horizon is shorter, whereas larger institutions, for instance, in the United States, universities have very long-term horizons. So I just wonder how to think about the need for a longer term view on the one hand, and the typical interest anyway of the retail investor, because I can see that being a potential conflict.
Yeah, I agree that there is a tension here, and it's a tension that that I think is characteristic of the action plan as I presented it, with its three aims. On the one hand, the desire to bridge, close the financing gap, and on the other hand, to promote long-termism, primarily among managers. But what if no one is really interested in long-termism, right? You may be interested for some, say 10, 20 years horizon, but maybe no longer. Or maybe 100 years, but that's not even what the long-termists in philosophy are thinking of when they speak about long-termism. So I agree there is an issue here. What is, I think, happening at the moment is that that these initiatives are mostly awareness campaigns. So this proposal was developed in more detail in the report that inspired the action plan, the expert group. group's report. But I couldn't find any concrete results on whether that has been effective so far. There are some requirements that certain managers or employees in banks have to satisfy, which are set by central banks. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have this fit and proper test that top management has to go through, and an awareness of long-term issues, climate issues, biodiversity issues, may be part of that test. But yeah, the question is whether that is exactly what we should be looking for.
Okay, so thank you, Boudewijn. I don't know if there are other questions. So, okay, I don't see questions coming from the audience. Also, okay, so I think we can stop here and thank again Boudewijn and Lisa for this stimulating interview and also very insightful debate. And see you soon on the next event on the Finance Line Seminars.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.